In Anderson's quarters there was a charged atmosphere, as each of the officers had a chance to put forward his opinion of the recent events. The outcome of this conference was that Major Anderson was to send a communication to Governor Pickens demanding an explanation as to why the batteries on Morris Island and Fort Moultrie had opened fire on the Star of the West. The note he sent read, "2 of your batteries fired this morning upon an unarmed vessel bearing the flag of my government. As I have not been notified that war has been declared by South Carolina against the government of the United States, I cannot but think that this hostile act was committed without your sanction or authority. Under that hope, and that alone, did I refrain from opening fire upon your batteries." He went on to say that should Pickens not disavow the actions his troops had taken, Anderson would regard it as an act of war, in which case, he continued, "I shall not permit any vessels to pass within range of the guns of my fort." The communication was taken ashore under a flag of truce by a young lieutenant, J. Norman Hall, who, when he arrived at Charleston, found the city in an uproar. It had been rumored that Fort Sumter was about to bombard the town, and that this young lieutenant had come to give warning. On giving Anderson's note to one of the governor's aides, Hall sat down to wait for the reply. He didn't have to wait long for the governor's response to be handed to him, with the suggestion that an aide should accompany him back to the dock with an armed guard for his protection. On Hall's return to Sumter, he handed the governor's note to Anderson, who was waiting for him in his quarters. Pickens' note was formal, explaining that South Carolina was an independent nation. It read, "The action of the United States in putting troops in Fort Sumter and then in sending reinforcements was clearly an act of aggression, and the firing from Morris Island and Fort Moultrie was abundantly justified. If Major Anderson felt that he must use his own guns now, the responsibility was his own." It went on, "Your position in this harbor has been tolerated by the authorities of the state, and it is not perceived how far the conduct which you propose to adopt can find a parallel in the history of any country." The question of international law brought up by this note made Anderson cautious as to his future actions, and much against the demands of his officers, he again erred to the side of caution, wanting time for second thoughts before adopting a collision course that could only have one outcome. Prominent leaders from the southern states feared that Governor Pickens might soon go too far and be drawn into a war that South Carolina on her own could not hope to win. Many sent words of caution to the governor. One of these was Jefferson Davis, who wrote, "The opinion of your friends is adverse to the presentation of a demand for the evacuation of Fort Sumter. The little garrison in its present position presses on nothing but a point of pride, and to you I need not say that war is made up of real elements. I hope we shall soon have a Southern Confederacy which will be ready to do all which interest or even pride demands." He finished by saying, "Your friends here think you can well afford to stand still so far as the presence of a garrison is concerned, and if things should continue as they are for a month, we shall then be in a condition to speak with a voice which all must hear and heed." As the days passed, both sides in Charleston entered into a period of uneasy peace. Negotiations were directed by Governor Pickens away from Fort Sumter towards Washington. Demands for the fort's surrender and Anderson's threat to close the port were held in abeyance. By the end of January 1861, 5 more cotton states had seceded from the Union to join South Carolina. These were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. On 8th February 1861, the Constitution for the Provisional Government of the Confederate States of America was adopted in Montgomery, Alabama. The next day, Jefferson Davis was elected president, and Alexander H. Stephens vice president. With the secession of these additional states, federal forts and arsenals in their jurisdiction were taken over without bloodshed by Southern militia, replacing the federal regulars guarding them. usually amounting to only a small caretaker force. National flags were being taken down all along the southern coast, as the new independent states replaced them with their own colors. However, over Fort Sumter the United States flag still flew, which was an offense to the entire Confederacy. On the 3rd March, Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard arrived in Charleston to take command of the Confederate forces. As he visited the military installations around the harbor, it only took him a short time to realize that he had a lot of work to do. Beauregard was in his early 40s, a dapper, confident, gifted soldier who would become known as the Napoleon in Gray. He was a man of impeccable manners and appearance, always turned out in beautifully tailored uniforms. He'd studied at West Point and had seen action in the Mexican War as an engineer officer on General Scott's staff, where he was wounded twice and twice brevetted for gallantry. He'd recently been a captain in the United States and had resigned from a post at West Point to join the Confederate Army. As Beauregard toured his new command with high-spirited officers that talked of elaborate plans for taking Sumter, he realized that the fort itself was not his main concern. Anderson and his small garrison were not a threat to the Confederacy while they were forced to sit it out in their own self-imposed isolation. The main threat, as Beauregard saw it, was if the Federals succeeded in another attempt to reinforce the garrison, then he and his forces would have the devil's own job getting them out. With a full complement of men and all the cannons they had available, mounted and manned, Sumter would become impregnable, like Gibraltar. With this in mind, Beauregard set about rearranging the batteries so that not only was Sumter the target, the harbor too could be sealed off, making it impossible for Federal forces to reinforce Anderson. On the 4th March, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States, or what remained of them. 30,000 people watched the proceedings outside the Capitol, but because of threats to the new president's life, troops were posted everywhere to protect him. In his inaugural address, Lincoln reaffirmed that he felt states voting for secession were in error, since the Union should be perpetual. He maintained once again that he would uphold the Union, saying to the refractory Southerners, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." After his inauguration, Lincoln was faced with his own cabinet and military leaders' pessimism as to whether or not Sumter could be reinforced. The northern newspapers were just as dismal in their speculations, predicting that Sumter would be handed over any day to the Southern authorities. Surrounded by so many unfavorable points of view, it took the new president a full month to make up his mind about which alternative he should adopt. Lincoln finally decided against the majority of his cabinet and their negative attitudes, and opted instead to help Anderson and his men if he could. He had read letters sent by the major to the War Department saying that, owing to the lack of supplies, he could only hope to hold out a few more weeks. And yet, he also strongly advised that no attempt should be made to send reinforcements to their aid, because the strength of the Confederate batteries on Morris Island and the guns remounted in Fort Moultrie presented too much of a threat to any such expedition. Lincoln, bearing Major Anderson's warning in mind, sent for Gustavus Fox, who was a prosperous businessman, but earlier in life had spent 15 years in the Navy. Fox had put forward to the government a straightforward yet cunning plan for reinforcing Sumter that might make a fight unnecessary. Fox's plan was simple. Men and supplies would be taken down to Charleston by transports with men of war for escort. Then, on a moonless night, the soldiers and supplies would be transferred into small boats such as whalers or landing craft, and tugboats would tow them to Sumter before the Confederates knew what was happening. Lincoln had been impressed by Fox's plan and his absolute confidence in his ability to carry it out. He was possibly the only man in Washington who believed Sumter could be reached by a successful expedition. Lincoln confided in him. "Mr. Fox, I am in a position of a man sitting on a fence, and I don't know which side to get down on. For on both sides it seems there is quicksand. Therefore, I need your help. I want you to go down to Charleston and visit Major Anderson. I want you to find out what his true position is down there. So, when you return, if you still think your plan is practicable, then I can get off this damn fence and walk again." "I shall leave immediately, Mr. President," said Fox. "I hate to see anyone seated uncomfortable." "Then I wish you were in my cabinet, Mr. Fox. I wish you were," replied Lincoln. Fox arrived in Charleston 2 days later and presented himself to Governor Pickens, explaining that he had not come to give Anderson orders, just to see the general condition of the garrison. Pickens agreed that he could visit the fort, and he was dropped off at the wharf that night by a Confederate steamer. Anderson was pessimistic when he heard Fox's plan and said, "The only way I think that this fort can now be reinforced is if troops were landed on Morris Island and stormed the batteries, which would mean gathering a large fleet. If you followed your plan, Mr. Fox, boats, however small, entering the harbor might still be heard if they are not seen, and Fort Moultrie has at least a dozen guns bearing on the wharf where those boats must be unloaded. So I don't think your chances are very bright, I'm sorry to say." "There must be a risk in any plan, Major," Fox replied, "and equally there are often mistakes made by the enemy, and luck to take into account." "Why take risks with lives when we are not even at war?" questioned Anderson. "However, I do agree that you should tell the President that the troops will not be able to stay in this fort after the 15th April unless new supplies are received." Fox returned to Washington and made his report to the President, which included Major Anderson's last statement. By the 4th April, Lincoln had made up his mind and convinced most of the men around him that an expedition should be sent to supply Sumter. Fox was again sent for, as he was the man, Lincoln felt sure, who would be able to carry out such a formidable task. On his arrival at the White House, Fox was taken straight to the President, who told him, "I have now decided that we will send help to Sumter, and I want you to make preparations for an expedition to supply that fort." Fox had waited a long time for these orders, but he felt obliged to point out, "Mr. President, when I visited Major Anderson last month at your orders, he told me then that he and his troops would not be able to remain in the fort after the 15th April. I believe he has also stated this in letters to the War Department, which you have been privy to. It is now the 4th. To fit out an expedition, I must return to New York, charter a ship, fuel and supply it, load her with soldiers and supplies for Sumter, then steam 630 miles to Charleston. I hope, sir, there is enough time?" Lincoln's expression did not change, saying, "Mr. Fox, since my inauguration, I've been surrounded by pessimism. You, sir, were the crown amongst the thorns, always being confident in your approach to this expedition. Please don't change now. All you can do is your best, and I'm sure that will be enough." Fox could do nothing but acknowledge his President's confidence in him. Lincoln then went on to explain the naval arrangements that had been made to assist him. 3 warships will be put in support of your attempt: the Powhatan, Pocahontas, and Pawnee, plus the revenue cutter Harriet Lane. These ships will remain cruising off the bar at the entrance to the harbor. I hope they will not have to be used, but if they have to be, they will be able to force an entry to Charleston if your attempt to reach the fort is interfered with." "I hope that won't be necessary, sir. I still hope to reach the fort under cover of darkness, taking the guards by surprise," replied Fox. "Well, now you have me, Mr. Fox. I feel like a chameleon about to change its color, yet I feel it's necessary to do so. The one big difference I want to make to your original plan, which relied on stealth to enter the harbor under darkness, is that I'm going to warn Governor Pickens officially in advance of what I intend to do. I shall tell him your expedition will be protected by warships with orders to open fire if there is any trouble." Lincoln explained that the necessity for this warning was far-reaching. Lincoln did not want the United States to be seen to fire the first shot. It was important that, if there was going to be a war, the first shot should be fired by a Southern gun. If it were the other way around, Lincoln had concluded it might force the other slave states and the border states Kansas, Missouri, and Kentucky to secede and join the Confederacy. On the evening of the 8th April, a War Department clerk from Washington named Robert S. Chew arrived in Charleston and was granted an interview with Governor Pickens, during which he read the governor the following: "I am directed by the President of the United States to notify you to expect an attempt to be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only, and that, if such an attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice or in case of an attack upon the fort." This message was immediately telegraphed to Montgomery, where President Davis and his cabinet considered it. General Beauregard, who was now in command of the approximately 7,000 troops in Charleston, was ordered to be active and alert, as if you were in the presence of an enemy contemplating to surprise you. After his visit with Lincoln, Fox made all speed to New York, where he chartered the liner Baltic and two tugs, the Uncle Ben and Yankee. He had his small fleet loaded and ready to sail by the 9th April. Unbeknown to him, as he hastened to get things prepared, he had already lost one of his escort ships. Because of confusion over orders, the Powhatan, which was intended to be the flagship, had sailed for Pensacola and not Charleston. On the 10th April, Fox put to sea in the Baltic. The tugs and the warships having gone on ahead, he was to rendezvous with them again off the bar at Charleston. Also, on the 10th April, in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederate capital, President Davis, in the presence of his new cabinet, ordered that the following message should be sent to General Beauregard at Charleston: "If you have no doubt of the authorized character of the agent who communicated to you the intention of the Washington government to supply Fort Sumter by force, you will at once demand its evacuation, and if this is refused, proceed in such a manner as you may determine to reduce it." Secretary of State Robert Toombs, who had expected to be voted President of the Confederacy instead of Davis, was totally against this move, saying, "At this time it's suicide, murder, and will lose us every friend in the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest which extends from mountains to ocean, and legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." Davis listened to Toombs and replied, "Lincoln has left us no other choice in the matter. He is intent on reinforcing Sumter, which is a breach of international law, as we are an independent nation who he is now set to invade." "He is not reinforcing Sumter," shouted Toombs. "He wants to supply Sumter with provisions only. He, sir, is trying to make us fire the first shot if there is to be a war, and that will lose us many friends." Toombs was adamant on this fact. "I say again," said Davis, "that we cannot permit a federal expedition to supply Sumter. It would be an act of war against our nation, and as President I will not permit it to happen. Gentlemen, let us put it to the vote." Before they had a chance, Toombs got up to speak again. Davis and his cabinet listened politely, but Toombs' warning was ignored, and the message was sent to General Beauregard. The stakes had been getting higher and higher for the last few months, and now neither president wanted to back down. If a civil war was about to unfold, it was to unfold over a boatload of supplies for a handful of hungry soldiers. The next day, the 11th April, was cloudy. There was a heavy swell in the harbor and a light breeze that kept the flags that were everywhere in Charleston fluttering. Rumors were abroad that Yankee warships were steaming up and down off the bar. The atmosphere in the streets was thick with excitement as the crowds watched the long columns of soldiers marching through the streets to the sound of fife and drum, going to their positions on the coast. To the watching crowds, it seemed that there must be thousands and thousands of these lean soldiers who smiled and waved to everyone as they passed. All around the harbor, soldiers in gray and brown uniforms prepared themselves in their positions. They hoped at last this might be the moment when General Beauregard would give the order to open fire on those Yankees in Fort Sumter. To many of the soldiers that manned the batteries, forming Beauregard's circle of fire around Fort Sumter, that time couldn't come soon enough. To most of the rank and file, who just took orders and carried them out to the best of their ability, the thought of what they might be entering into, once the first shots were fired, never crossed their minds. For them it just meant the waiting might soon be over. The days and weeks of training, digging trenches and gun emplacements, and the boredom of inaction might shortly end. General Beauregard took a considerable amount of time composing the note that he was to send to Major Anderson demanding his evacuation of Sumter. He, of course, did realize the significance of the path on which he and his new country were about to embark, but as a loyal officer of the Confederacy, he did not question the decision of his leaders. He was conscious, however, of the importance that the document he was writing would have in future history, should Major Anderson decide to fight. So he picked his words carefully, and by the time he had finally finished, it was well after midday. He then read the finished communication to the three men he had selected to deliver it. These were Colonel James Chestnut and Captain Stephen D. Lee, both aides to Beauregard, and Lieutenant Colonel James A. Chisholm, one of Governor Pickens' aides. On asking for their opinion, they all agreed that it said all that had to be said. It was concise and to the point. "Well then, gentlemen, it's getting late. You'd better be on your way," said Beauregard. "You carry on your shoulders the weight of a great responsibility. I wish you good luck." The three officers saluted Beauregard and left, making their way to the wharf, where they climbed into a small boat carrying a white flag of truce that had been waiting for them. A few moments later they shoved off, the three men trying to make themselves comfortable for the 3-mile row to the fort. On reaching Sumter, they clambered up onto the wharf and were escorted to a small room inside the fort, where they were introduced to Major Anderson, to whom Colonel Chestnut gave Beauregard's message. Anderson took the communication and excused himself. The three Confederate officers waited patiently while Anderson shared the contents of the note with his officers, the last part of which read as follows: "I am ordered by the government of the Confederate States to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter. My aides, Colonel Chestnut and Captain Lee, are authorized to make such a demand of you. All proper facilities will be afforded for the removal of yourself and your command, together with company arms and property, and all your private property, to any post in the United States which you may select. The flag, which you have upheld so long and with so much fortitude under the most trying circumstances, may be saluted by you on taking it down." When he had finished reading, Anderson looked up to take advice from his officers. They, of course, were all professional soldiers. For them there could be only one reply under the circumstances. They'd been ordered by their government to hold the fort, and that was all there was to it. Anderson agreed with them, composed a reply, and handed it to the waiting officers, offering his regrets that he could not comply with General Beauregard's demands. As he walked with them back to their boat, he asked if General Beauregard would open fire at once, without giving further notice. Colonel Chestnut replied, "No, I can say to you he will not, without giving you further notice." "Then," replied Anderson, who it could be seen by all present was extremely moved by the events that were taking place, "then I shall take no action until we are fired upon." He hesitated for a while. then said, which may have been one last desperate attempt on his part to delay or put off the bombardment. "If you do not batter us to pieces, we will be starved out in a few days." Colonel Chestnut paused on hearing this, turned, and asked Anderson to repeat it. When Anderson confirmed what he had said, Chestnut replied, "In which case there may be no need for us to open a bombardment. Do I have your permission to include this information in my report to General Beauregard?" Anderson seemed suddenly reluctant to let his remark be put in a formal report, but gave his consent, saying, "I made a statement of fact. You can use the information in any way you choose." Chestnut bade Anderson farewell and climbed down into the boat, joining the other officers. As the boat pulled away from the fort, he looked back and saw Anderson still standing on the wharf. He stood alone and quite still, watching them as they pulled away. Chestnut wondered what he must be thinking at this moment. On their return to Charleston, the three officers made their report to General Beauregard, who considered Major Anderson's parting remark to Colonel Chestnut important enough to inform the Secretary of War. The decision, then, whether or not to call off the bombardment rested in the hands of the politicians and not his. President Jefferson Davis, on reading Beauregard's telegram, was skeptical. He, of course, would have been only too pleased to find a peaceful solution to the occupation of Fort Sumter, but he was inclined to think this was just another ploy to gain more time, so that Anderson could be reinforced. However, as he did not want to let any possibility of a solution without bloodshed slip away, he ordered Secretary Walker to send the following telegraph to Charleston: "Do not desire needlessly to bombard Fort Sumter. If Anderson will state the time at which, as indicated by him, he will evacuate, and agree that in the meantime he will not use his guns against us, unless ours should be employed against Fort Sumter, you are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. If this, or its equivalent, be refused, reduce the fort as your judgment decides to be most practicable." On receipt of this communication, General Beauregard ordered Chisholm, Chestnut, and Lee to return to Fort Sumter one last time to see if Anderson would comply with these new conditions. By now it was very late, and by the time their boat reached the fort it was well past midnight on the 12th April, 1861. Only Colonel Chestnut and Major Lee went ashore this time. They were shown inside the fort and led to a badly lit casement in which this final communication was passed by Colonel Chestnut to Major Anderson. The Major took his time in reading the note, then excused himself, leaving the two aides while he passed on this new information to his officers, who were gathered in the garrison laundry. A conference followed between them which went on for some time, the outcome of which was that Anderson would tell the Confederate officers that he would evacuate the fort on the 15th, subject to certain conditions. Anderson returned with Doubleday and a few other officers to where Chestnut and Lee were waiting. "Gentlemen," Anderson announced, "in answer to General Beauregard's last message, I can tell you this. I shall be forced to leave this fort on the 15th, as I shall not be able to feed my men after that date. However, these circumstances could change should I be resupplied or reinforced, or I receive contradictory instructions from my government." "Major," Chestnut asked, "will you agree not to use your guns?" Anderson stood firm, with his hands clasped in front of him. He tilted his head slightly to look at the colonel. "No, sir, I cannot agree to that. I shall defend this fort against any hostile demonstration. I am also ordered to assist any ship or boat flying the national flag that might enter the harbor." Chestnut hesitated, turning to Captain Lee to see if he had any comment to make, but Lee remained silent. Looking back at Anderson, Chestnut asked, "Will that be the contents of the reply you intend to make to General Beauregard?" Anderson nodded his agreement. Chestnut then said, You realize that this will not be enough to prevent General Beauregard from carrying out his duty. Surely, after all this time, after all the long negotiations that have taken place, you can agree not to use your guns for the sake of peace?" "No, sir. My orders are clear enough. I cannot agree to that. I repeat, I shall evacuate this fort on the 15th, as after that date I shall not be able to feed my men. But should before this date I receive supplies or new orders, then that would create a new set of circumstances. That is what I shall now go and put in writing to General Beauregard." Anderson once more took his leave from the two officers. Captain Lee was the first to speak after Anderson's departure, saying, "I think he's just wasting time. He must know that there are Yankee ships outside the harbor. I think he will try and keep us here till daylight." Colonel Chestnut agreed with Lee, adding, "The next time he returns, we must insist on his reply." Major Anderson still continued to make every effort to delay, but eventually, after the insistence of the two aides, he delivered his reply at 3:15 a.m., which was immediately read by both the officers. On finding its contents unsatisfactory, they sent for Colonel Chisholm, who'd been waiting in the boat with Roger A. Pryor, a fiery congressman from Virginia. Chisholm joined the group in the candlelit basement and agreed immediately that Major Anderson had given no answer at all. The three further agreed that there was little point in returning to Charleston to get Beauregard's final verdict, which would only waste more time. So, in front of Anderson and some of his officers, Colonel Chestnut dictated to Captain Lee his reply to Major Anderson's final refusal to the Confederate government's terms. It read, "Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April 12, 1861, 3:20 a.m. Sir, by the authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open the fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. We have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servants, James Chestnut, Jr., Aide-de-Camp, Stephen D. Lee, Captain, C.S. Army, Aide-de-Camp." This note was handed to Major Anderson, who, although he was present as it was dictated, he still read it aloud again so that everyone could hear. He seemed profoundly moved, as was everyone who was present in that dimly lit casement, for the words that Anderson now recounted were to plunge his country into the Civil War that over the past few months he'd tried so hard to avoid, but now all his options had run out.